Well, good morning. It's good to be with you all this morning. If you have a Bible, I would invite you to open that to Genesis 16 with me. I'm going to be looking at Genesis 16 this morning. As you're turning there, I think one of the doctrines, the doctrines that is the most kind of underappreciated and overlooked in our lives as kind of Western Americans is the doctrine of God's providence. I think we as a people have hardly even kind of a grasp or even a concept of what that doctrine means, let alone why it is important. Even now, as I sort of talk about God's providence, it's possible that many of you would hear that and say, well, what is that? What does that even mean? Well, God's providence, right, it is his care for his creation. As one writer puts it, it is his purposeful sovereignty. Specifically, that purposeful sovereign oversight that God gives to his creation and to his creatures. It's a doctrine that's built on the idea that God is one who perfectly sees and he provides for and he governs his creation according to his eternal wisdom and power and goodness. When theologians talk about God's providence, they will typically talk about it in two important ways, right? So we'll talk about God's general providence, and that's a way of talking about the way that God cares for and oversees all of his creation, every moment, and he holds all things together. He governs according to the counsel of his wisdom and his power. That's that general care that he has for creation, right? Like Job can talk about the way that he cares for the animal in the woods that none of us even see, right? That general care that he has. But they'll also talk about God's special providence, right? The fact that God has a kind of unique care and provision for his people. That God is uniquely committed to making not just promises, but seeing those promises be brought to pass in the lives of his people according to his own power and his plan. And I think either one of these doctrines is one that we have kind of lost sight of. Right? We've grown kind of cold to it as Americans and as sort of modern, Western, technologically advanced people. And if we step back and we kind of think about our culture, I think few ideas are more out of step with us than the idea that God is the one who providentially leads and guides all things. Right? How does God fit in this picture that we have of ourselves as those who are self-determined and self-sufficient, right? Those two sort of sacred values of Western sort of American life, right? We are the people who are given that American dream to go out and make ourselves, to be self-made, to pull ourselves up by our bootstraps, which is a ridiculous phrase, by the way, if you actually sit down and think about it. But we value those things, right? That self-determination, self-sufficiency. And how does God fit into the picture of that kind of American ideal of self-sufficiency? Well, there are those famous words from Benjamin Franklin, right? God helps those who help themselves. No words, I think, better encapsulate that sort of American ethic of what it means for us to think about how God fits into the equation of our own self-determination and self-sufficiency. Right? God's maybe somewhere in the equation out there, but ultimately it's first and foremost up to us. Right? We've got to do the work. We've got to get things done on our own, and maybe God can step in when we need that assist, but ultimately if things are going to happen, we've got to be the ones to make it happen ourselves. Right? It's no wonder with ideas like that we have no room for a concept that our lives are completely dependent on his providential care. But I think as we look at this passage this morning, hopefully we'll be challenged with this very different picture. One that doesn't just expose this kind of idol of self-sufficiency and self-determination, but one that shows us how faithful and providential God's care for us is, even in the most sort of seemingly unseen and insignificant moments in our lives. And no matter who we are or what is going on, God sees us and he cares for us. As a reminder, like last week, we saw God going out of his way to sort of vividly affirm his covenant promises to Abram. Those two promises of an heir and a home. Right? And God confirmed those promises with those two amazing signs, right? That the stars in the sky and that ceremony that was marked by sacrifice. And those signs, right, they didn't just affirm God's promises. They didn't just say to Abram, yeah, God's going to do these things for you. But they dramatically displayed God's commitment to bring those promises and purposes to pass by Abram's power? No, by God's power alone. That was so clear in that way that God carried out that covenant ceremony there at the end of chapter 15 when he knocked Abraham out. You know, Abraham is dead asleep, and God goes through with that ceremony all on his own as a way to say to Abram, like, one thing should be clear to him as he walks away from that moment, right? God and God alone will accomplish these things. God and God alone will do it. And yet, I don't know how much time has passed between that moment and now, but as we come to this passage, I think it's almost as though Abram and his wife have just lost sight of those signs. They've completely lost sight of what those things were meant to convey. That God and God alone would fulfill these promises. Let's look at this story. It's a tragic one, but it's also one I think that has much to teach us. Let's start there, beginning in verse 1 of chapter 16. Now Sarai, Abram's wife, had borne him no children. She had a female Egyptian servant whose name was Hagar. And Sarai said to Abram, "Behold, now the Lord has prevented me from bearing children. Go into my servant. It may be that I shall obtain children by her." And Abram listened to the voice of Sarai. So after Abram had lived 10 years in the land of Canaan, Sarai, Abram's wife, took Hagar the Egyptian, her servant, and gave her to Abram, her husband, as a wife. And he went into Hagar, and she conceived. And when she saw that she had conceived, she looked with contempt on her mistress. And Sarai said to Abram, "May the wrong be done to me be on you. I gave my servant to your embrace, and when she saw that she had conceived, she looked on me with contempt. May the Lord judge between you and me." But Abram said to Sarai, "Behold, your servant is in your power. Do to her as you please." Then Sarah dealt harshly with her, and she fled from her. The angel of the Lord found her by a spring of water in the wilderness, the spring on the way to Shur. And he said, "Hagar, servant of Sarai, where have you come from, and where are you going?" She said, "I am fleeing from my mistress Sarai." The angel of the Lord said to her, "Return to your mistress and submit to her." The angel of the Lord also said to her, "I will surely multiply your offspring, so that they cannot be numbered for multitude." And the angel of the Lord said to her, "Behold, you are pregnant, and you shall bear a son. You shall call his name Ishmael, because the Lord has listened to your affliction. He shall be a wild donkey of a man, his hand against everyone, and everyone's hand against him, and he shall dwell over against all his kinsmen." So he called the name of the Lord, who spoke to her, "You are a God of seeing." For she said, "Truly, here I have seen him who looks after me." Therefore the well was called Bir Lahai Roi. It lies between Kadesh and Bered. And Hagar bore Abram a son, and Abram called the name of his son, whom Hagar bore, Ishmael. Abram was 86 years old when Hagar bore Ishmael to Abram. Well, I think for all the highs in Abram's life that we've seen over the last few chapters, this is clearly a low point for him. It's clearly a low point for him and his wife and for this servant, Hagar. In many ways, this story is kind of the polar opposite of the story that we looked at last week, right? Abram and his wife are far from trusting in God, believing God. They are far from doing that. They are instead striving in their own strength to try to bring about God's promises of a son. And if our passage last week was kind of this pivotal, monumentous, sort of significant moment in Abram's life and that sort of story of redemption, right? This is sort of more or less kind of a detour that leads really to nowhere. It's more or less a kind of dead end in the grand scheme of things. Like the events of this story, they don't serve to advance God's purposes in any clear way, right? This is a story that reads more like a soap opera than sort of some redemptive narrative in God's larger story. And yet I think God has given us this story and all of its messiness and its ugliness for a reason. Right? Because this is a story that continues to highlight to us that God is faithful even in the midst of the sins and weaknesses and failures of his people. Like that's evident here. We see this sort of clear parallel. Excuse me. No, I'm good. Excuse me, sorry. All right. Swallowed something went down the road pipe. I'll be all right. All right. Right, so we have this clear parallel to that story that we saw back at the end of chapter 12. Right, Abram and Sarai in Egypt. Right, we see this sort of similar movement to that story. So in verses 1 through 6, we see this sort of faithless plan that fails absolutely terribly. Right, and we read Sarah's sort of plan with Hagar as a surrogate mother, as a child in order to bring about this child of promise. And this failure here, right, it's evident in the fact that this decision to take matters into their own hands is not just a problem, but it produces not so much a child, but a host of kind of sin and suffering in their lives. But the product of this decision is clearly one that ruins everything. And then in verses 7 through 14, just like that previous story back in Egypt, God steps in that sort of darkest moment, and in his faithfulness, he encounters Hagar there in the wilderness. He rescues yet another woman who has been compromised by the foolishness of man. And he shows his providential care for her as one who's been used and abused and cast aside. I think both of these kind of two parts to this story, really when we put them together, they help us to see, right, that God's promises, they're not advanced through human plans, but through God's providence alone. That's really the big picture of this passage. The main idea for us here this morning is that God's promises are advanced not through human plans, but through his providence alone. And as we kind of unpack this story, I want us to see that even if the events of this story don't ultimately sort of serve God's larger purposes, right, it's a story that has much to teach us, not just about Abram and his family, but about us. Because this is a story that shows us, right, our own tendency to turn away from God's promises, to take things into our own hands, to try to accomplish what he alone can accomplish. But it's also a story that has so much to teach us about the way that God meets us and cares for us, even in the sort of ugly, most seemingly insignificant moments in our lives. Let's start by looking at this plan in verses 1 through 6, this failed plan. Right? Like Abram's faithless and failed plan in 12:12, this story also begins with a faithless and failed plan. This plan is kind of doomed from the start. But it's interesting because the roles are essentially reversed here, right? This time it's Sarai who comes up with this plan, not Abram. And Abram's the one who goes along with it. And what's her plan? Well, it's straightforward, right? There in verses 1 through 3, she comes to Abram and she says, "Behold, the Lord has prevented me from bearing children. Go into my servant, that I may obtain children by her." Right? She wants a child. She sees this servant, Hagar, probably a young woman capable of bearing children where she is not. Right? She cannot have children, and she sees in her a potential surrogate. Right? She maybe recognizes that God has promised Abram a son from his own body, but she's barren. She cannot seem to bring this to pass on her own. And so I think in an attempt, maybe not so much to fulfill God's promises, but simply just to obtain a child that she can call her own, she urges Abram to sleep with Hagar and to bear perhaps a child that she could claim as hers. And this isn't, I think, a plan that she just sort of magically came up with out of her own wisdom. It was a fairly common practice in her culture. It was really a pretty normal, expected approach to surrogacy, right? You were not just, it's not just understood if you did something like this, it was almost kind of expected. If you were the wife of a husband, that you would kind of encourage this. But whether or not it's a common practice or not, right? That's a whole other question as to whether or not it's a good plan. And Sarah seems to know that this is a common practice. She raises it as an option. And again, Abram sort of just goes along with it. Right? Like Sarah in the previous story, he doesn't protest. He doesn't sort of, wait a minute, this seems like a bad idea. He just, all right, sounds like whatever. But I think there's a number of reasons why we should just know from the start that this plan is doomed to fail. First off, I think it's built from a horrible starting place. I think we get some indications here that neither Abram or Sarai are in a good place. I don't think they are just trying to faithfully bring about God's promises. Like, well, maybe we're supposed to do this, or maybe we're supposed to do that. Sometimes it's sort of talked about in that way, but I think what's clear here, Sarah speaks of her barrenness in a way that seems almost as though she's blaming God. Like she is, I think, potentially bitter and frustrated and tired of waiting, tired of crying, tired of feeling that sting of not being able to have her own children. She's coming to Abram and she's saying, look, I can't do this. God's not letting me do it. So we better figure this out because I'm tired of this. And I think the fact that Abram just sort of goes along with it, it speaks to his kind of frustration potentially and his apathy as well. Right? He doesn't say, well, hold on, Sarah, that we need to trust the Lord here. He's just resigned to it. I don't think this is a plan that's sort of born out of an eagerness to be faithful to God. I think this is a plan born out of two kind of frustrated and discontented people who have lost sight of God's commitment to fulfill his promises himself. And the result of that is not just that they take things into their own hands, but they come up with a plan that is itself just thoroughly bad, both in terms of like its moral approach and just what we would expect to happen. It's not just that their hearts are in a place of potential sin, but I think the plan itself is wrong, like morally wrong. If we've been keeping up with Genesis, we should know that it doesn't really matter if this is culturally acceptable. This is clearly against God's design for marriage. I think we saw back in Genesis 2, God's design for that monogamous covenant relationship of marriage. This is a clear sort of violation of that. And I think it's not a surprise that in both of these cases, sort of Abram's plan and in hers, what's the fundamental problem with each plan? Well, it betrays their covenant of marriage. Like both plans are really about kind of betraying that covenant that they have made to one another. You know, in Abram's case, it's about lying about whether or not she's even his wife. And here there's a similar kind of problem in that Abram is to take someone else, betraying the idea that Sarah is essentially his wife. Right? The whole foundation of this plan, it's rotten. Nothing good could possibly come of this. But I think, of course, the clearest problem is that they are taking things into their own hands. Right? After God has so clearly demonstrated to him that he and he alone will make this happen. But they are tired of waiting for him to act. They are tired of waiting, and rather than continuing to wait, they take things into their own hands. And we should immediately know, based on that sign of God walking through those two halves last week, this is not the way to go. This is not going to turn out well. But there's so much, I think, for us to see in this example of this plan. Right? How many times have you and I been in a similar place in our lives where we're just tired of waiting? Right? We're tired of hoping. We're tired of longing and begging for God to act. Maybe it's not childlessness. Maybe it's a job. Maybe it's a desire that we have. Whatever it is, we grow tired of waiting for God to act. We grow tired and frustrated. Maybe we allow that frustration, that weariness, and that pain to become apathy or bitterness. We let that longing drive us to take things into our own hands, to say, well, I am going to make this happen. I must have this. And if God's not going to give it to me, then I'll make it happen. And how much of us have been in that same position in moments in our lives? Not just once, but maybe over and over and over again. And it's not wrong for us to be in those moments. It's not wrong for us to be frustrated, to be weary, to be tired, to be longing for God to act, even to feel the sting. What is a problem, friends, is when we allow that pain and that frustration to push us towards sin, to push us towards that place where we give up on waiting, where we take things into our own hands. In those moments, God invites us to continue to cry out to Him, to lament and to grieve, and to make those frustrations and those pains known to Him. And you say, well, how long does He want me to do that? The answer is, as long as it takes for Him to act. We don't like that answer, but it's the answer. How long do I have to wait on God? As long as you have to wait on Him. At the moment those griefs and pains drive us to that place where we try to take things into our own hands, we're off to a terrible start. Right? We can be sure that nothing good will come of it. And look what happens here, right? They are thinking, well, this is how we're going to get things done. Right? What's the product? Well, it's not so much a child, but it's just a pain. Sin and suffering just abounds in this story immediately. Right? As we look at the way that this plan kind of plays out in verses 4 through 6, right? This child is conceived. So on paper, it's a success, right? Okay, it worked. Abram has a child. But the story doesn't so much focus on the child, but of all of the sort of terrible sin and suffering that is produced. Right? Things get off to a bad start immediately when this child is conceived. Look at verse 4. When he went into Hagar and she conceived, and when she saw that she'd conceived, she looked with contempt on her mistress. Right? So Hagar has conceived. What's happening? Immediately, she has contempt for Sarai. I think you have to feel a little bit of compassion here for Hagar. If you think about what's going on, like given where she's come from, I think it's so easy to understand how she would have found herself in this position, right? She is a servant. She's probably spent her whole life being overlooked, unseen, insignificant. Right? Nobody cares about her. She's not important. She's basically just one who exists to meet the needs of others. And she's been used here to do that. But now she's not a servant. She's a mom. And not just a mom, but a mother to Abram's child. Right? Everyone's looking at her in this moment, probably celebrating her. Probably the most attention and significance she's ever received in her life. I think it's one thing for her to be honored in this moment. Right? It's not wrong for her to feel blessed by God and honored. But how quickly does that turn from that kind of humility and honor to this contempt for Sarai? And instead of feeling honor, probably for the first time in her life, she thinks, hey, now I'm important. Now I'm the one that matters. I'm better than her. Right? She couldn't do this. I did. Like, I matter. And she doesn't. It's one thing to feel honored. It's another thing to turn that back against someone. But notice how I think Hagar's contempt for Sarah, it's overshadowed by Sarah's own rage, jealous rage. Look at verses 5 and 6. How does Sarah respond? May the wrong be done to me, she's speaking to Abram, be on you. I gave my servant to your embrace, and when she saw that she had conceived, she looked on me with contempt. May the Lord judge between you and me. Right? Think about what's happening here. Sarai is understandably hurt by this. Right? She's hurt by this newfound confidence from Hagar. But instead of dealing with it, maybe in a healthy and godly way, when we already know that that's sort of out of the picture by the basis of this whole plan, but instead of dealing with it in a healthy way, like, Abram, I think we should talk to Hagar. I think she's kind of got some pride stuff that's going on. We should probably help her. Right? She doesn't say that. What does she do? I think she essentially blames Abram and she curses him. Right? Even though this is her idea. Right? She's the one who brought this plan to him, and now it's backfired, and she's going to him and she's saying, look, this is your fault. You slept with her. And you gave her a child, and now she thinks she's better than me. This is your fault. I hope God makes you feel as miserable as I do right now. May God deal with you, Abram. Right? She is turning the blame back on him. Right? She's not just jealous and angry, but she's blame shifting. And what does Abram do, right? He also is not sort of a paragon of righteousness in this moment. What does he say? Oh, Sarah, I know you're hurt. I know this is a hard situation. I know this has been so difficult for you, right? I know this is probably making things so much harder. Let me talk to her. She's my wife now too. I have to care for her, but I'll make it clear to her that she needs to treat you with respect, right? Does he say any of that? No. Right? He is passive. What does he say to her? Right? Behold, your servant is in your power. Do to her as you please. This is basically his way of saying, I don't care what you do here. She's your servant. Do whatever you want to her. Why are you blaming me? Why are you talking to me? Go deal with it yourself. She's your servant. What a terrible response. Again, his passivity is a huge problem here. And then what does Sarai decide to do, right? She has it in her own power to deal with her however she wants. We're told that she deals harshly with her and that she fled. Right? She deals so harshly with her that this pregnant woman thinks, I need to run away. I need to just run off into the middle of the wilderness. The word that's used here for dealing harshly with her, it's a strong word. It could indicate anything from just sort of verbal to just full-on physical abuse. I don't want to necessarily impugn Sarah in a way I don't know for certain, but friends, it's also the same term that God uses to describe the abuse that the Israelites will suffer under the hands of the Egyptians. And this term that Hagar is fleeing, it's a term that literally is used to describe someone who is running for their life. This is not a pretty picture. This is a ugly and awful, awful moment in this story. Right? This is not a good plan. It is awful. It is completely backfired. It is blown up in their face. And everything about it is just destructive and ruinous and painful, right? They have basically treated this woman like an animal. They have used her, they've abused her, and now they've just driven her away and discarded her, right? They don't go after her. And the very thing that they were striving after in the first place, right? A son, right? He's also been driven away. So he's not even in the picture anymore. They don't even have what they were after in the first plan. This is a disaster. Right? The product of this plan was not a promised son, but just pain. Pain and suffering and evil for everyone involved. And this is uncomfortable. Like, we don't love this part of the story. We don't want to lean into this and to think about it. We kind of want to move on. But the reality is, this is a clear and sobering picture for us of what it looks like when we try to take matters into our own hands. Like, it is no less ugly, no less problematic when we try to come up with our own sort of little man-made solutions, and sinful ones at that, to accomplish what God alone has promised. Like, the biggest danger of trying to come up with these types of solutions is that they succeed on paper. Right? That we actually get what we want initially, But usually what happens is when those plans seemingly succeed, it becomes pretty quickly apparent that the actual long-term result is that God is dishonored and people are hurt. When we turn away from trusting in God's promises to our own wisdom, trying to rely on our own ingenuity and our own efforts, friends, all we do is usually add more sin and more suffering to the picture. I recognize this perhaps started from that place of wanting to be out from underneath that pain that they were feeling. All they've done is added to it. Friends, we must not grow weary of waiting on God to act. I think the worst thing we can do is to try to take matters into our own hands. We must not grow weary of waiting for God to be the one to be faithful. And many times his care for us, it will show up when we least expect it. That's why we must wait. And that's what happens here. This brings us to the second half of the passage, and that second to and last point, God's faithful providence here. Right, Abram and his wife, they've failed to bring about God's promises. And they've driven Hagar away, but in verses 7 through 16, right, God shows up. He shows up in the wilderness to demonstrate the faithfulness of his providence, not to Abram, not to Sarai, but to this one who has been used and abused and cast aside when this plan has failed. But Hagar's run away, and in verse 7, we're told that she's in the wilderness, she's alone, and she's near the spring on the way to shore. In other words, this is a way of communicating. She's trying to go back to Egypt. It's a long trek when you're by yourself and you're pregnant. But she's sitting there thinking, my best shot is to try to go home. And what happens? Do Abram and Sarai come after her? No. Who comes after her? Who finds her? It's the Lord who finds her. The opening of verse 7 is right away. The angel of the Lord found her by a spring of water in the wilderness. That's some kind of debate, like who is this figure of the angel of the Lord? Is it kind of an appearance of God himself, or maybe it's an angel that speaks on behalf of God? Like either way, we're meant to see this as an encounter between Hagar and God. We're meant to see this, and Hagar understands it this way, as we'll see later in verse 13. But what does God say to her in this moment? He asks her a question. Hagar, where have you come from, and where are you going? And that's interesting. The Lord pursues her, he finds her, and he asks her a question. Where are you come from? Where are you going? Right? Why does the Lord need to find her? Right? Why does he need to ask these questions? Doesn't he know where she is? Doesn't he know what's going on? Doesn't he know where she's coming from and where she's going? Why does he ask her these questions? Of course, he knows the answer to these questions, right? Of course, he knew exactly where she was. Well, I think we're meant to see in this that this is not God kind of showing up to try to get clarity. God's not confused. This is God showing up in compassion. This is God in this moment pursuing this one who has been driven out. Abram and Sarai have driven her away in fear, but God is pursuing her in faithfulness. He is coming after her. He has found her, and he is inviting her to make her requests and her needs known to him. And recognize, like, he is doing all this even though she doesn't really advance any of his larger purposes. God could simply go, well, okay, that was a terrible plan. Glad she's out of the picture. All right, Abram, now we need to get to work. He doesn't show up to Abram and say, see what you did? Yeah, glad she's gone. No, he shows up to her. He pursues her. And he invites her to express her pain and her problems to him. I think it's such a beautiful picture of God's kindness and his faithfulness and his willingness to pursue us, even those of us who maybe feel unseen, insignificant, uncared for, even driven out. Friends, even when we feel discarded by others, even when we feel driven out by others, God has not abandoned us. Even when others do not see us, God comes after us. He will not drive us away, but he will pursue us. Even when we've made mistakes, right? She's not just completely innocent in this situation. She played a role. But God does not deal harshly with her, and he does not deal harshly with us in such moments. He pursues us, not because it advances necessarily in all cases his big, grand purposes, but simply because he's faithful. He's faithful, he's good, and he's kind. And like Hagar, he invites us to make our sin and our suffering known to him. And maybe there's moments where you felt like this, you felt like she feels in this moment. If that's the case, I want you to see the way that God cares for her and he pursues her, and be reminded that God does the same for us. This is a faithful picture of God's pursuit and his kindness. And it's one, I think, that points us to the gospel itself. Right? As we think about that reality, right? Even when we were lost and without hope, what did God do? He pursued us in love. Jesus, that good shepherd, left the 99 sheep and he went after the one lost sheep and he found us. Right? He is the one who has come to seek and to save the lost. He has pursued us. His commitment to save us was accomplished not by our own effort or through our own righteousness, but because of his faithfulness, his kindness, and his mercy to us. And he's demonstrated that to us through his perfect death, through Christ's perfect death in our place as sinners. I think God calls us to receive, not to earn, not to try to perform or strive our way into receiving that mercy and that grace, but he pursues us and he showers us with that grace, and he calls us to turn from our sins and simply to trust him, to put our trust in what Christ has done, not what we have done. That's the gospel. That's the gospel that's on display in God's faithful pursuit of this one here who is in bondage. God doesn't just pursue her, though. He has plans for her, plans that include a promise. What does he say to her in verse 9? What's his plan? Return. Return to your mistress and submit to her. Given what we just read, that's a bit of a shocking thing for God to say. It's surprising that God would tell her to do this in this moment. Go back to these people, these awful, awful people. That doesn't seem like a good idea. Why is God calling her to do this? As we'll see, it's because God does have a plan and a promise for her. It's not the same exact plan and promise that he has for Abram, but it mirrors that same plan in a way that I think is very important. Look at what God promises to her in verses 10 through 12. I will surely multiply your offspring so that they cannot be numbered for multitude. And the angel of the Lord said to her, behold, you are pregnant, you shall bear a son. You shall call his name Ishmael, because the Lord has listened to your affliction. He shall be a wild donkey of a man, his hand against everyone, and everyone's hand against him, and he shall dwell over and against all his kinsmen. I think what's amazing about this promise is the way it so clearly mirrors the one that God has made to Abram already. We've seen this multiple times. It's not the same promise, but it looks an awful lot like it, right? Just as Abram would have innumerable descendants, so too Hagar will have innumerable descendants. Just as Abram will have this promised son, so too Hagar will have a promised son. Why does that matter? Why is God giving her sort of her own version of this promise here? Well, I think it shows us two things. First, this promise doesn't serve God's larger purposes. We need to see that. It doesn't advance what God is actually intending to do here in Abram's life. This is a line of promise that, for all intents and purposes, doesn't lead us to Christ. Doesn't lead us to God's larger purposes in this story, unlike Abram's promised son. So why? Why does God make this promise to her? Well, I think it's simply, on the one hand, just God's kindness. Just God's kindness to her in this moment as one who is just misused in this way to be sort of a vessel for these promises, and then cast aside. God is essentially saying to her, I'm not going to do that. I'm going to honor you. I will give you offspring. That's what you were being used for, and I'm going to give you that. I'm going to honor you in that. This is a kindness and a faithfulness to one who is overlooked, who is cast aside in her pain and in her affliction, right? God sees her and he cares for her and he hears her. The name of the child that God gives to her, Ishmael, God hears. Name your child Ishmael so that you remember that I hear you. What does he say? Because the Lord has listened to your affliction. He heard you. Again, this is God showing up in compassion and faithfulness to one who is suffering in this moment. Not for some larger purpose, but simply because that's who he is. That's the way he cares for his people and his creatures. But I do think there is something else that's kind of happening here. I think this promise and this plan for her, it's a radical way, kind of offhandedly, for God to demonstrate not just his faithfulness to her, but I think it's also a way for God to remind Abram and Sarai of his faithfulness to them in a way that I think probably was meant to sting a little bit. Right? This is Abram's son, after all, and God is saying, here's what you're going to name this child. Abram is going to name this child this. Right? Even if this isn't the son that God promises him, right? Nonetheless, God promises an offspring to Abram's child. He promises an offspring, and his promises to Abram are so sure, they're so powerful, that it even extends in a way to this ill-gotten son. This is a way of God is saying, I told you I would make your descendants numerous. This is not the way I meant to do it, but I'm still going to honor that promise in a way. Because I want you to see that no matter what you do, I'm going to be faithful to what I promised. Ishmael might not be the chosen son or the chosen heir of promise, but he still will be a son of promise, a son of many. I think it's a way of God to remind Abram, I will be faithful, Abram. I will. Or he could have rejected this completely. He could have just completely rejected this project, but he doesn't. He provides a future and a place even for this child. Right? One that I think is going to be filled with conflict as he sort of prophesies, but a future that I think no doubt will include hope for these descendants of Ishmael as they have the potential to hear the good news of the gospel and become children of Abram, not by sort of a failed plan, but through the faith in the promises of God. And in all of this, God is showing his faithfulness and his promise to everyone involved in this awful plan. God is showing up and he's reminding everyone involved, I will be faithful even when you are not. I will see to caring for you even when you make a mess of things and you take things into your own hands. Right? Hagar sees that in this moment. She sees who God is. He is the God who doesn't just hear, but who sees and who cares for his people. Look at the way she responds to these promises. She doesn't say, well, this is a terrible plan. I'm not going back there. Like, thanks for the promise, but no thanks. In response to this promise, she says, she names the Lord that appears to her, that speaks to her. And what does she name him? God of seeing. El Roi, the God of seeing. I name you the God who sees. Right? You saw me, you found me, you cared for me, you've given me promises. Right? That longing for attention that she felt back there in that moment when everyone was celebrating her, right? She sees the real deal here. Right? What matters is not whether or not people are paying attention to me, but whether or not God sees me. That's the only thing that matters. And in this moment, she knows that God is a God who sees, not just all, but who sees her. Right? What does she name this place? Bir Laharoi, the well of the living one who sees me. He sees me. He hears me. He is the God who sees and who hears her. And she's recognizing in this moment what Sarai should have recognized all along. I can trust God. I can go back into this situation. I can wait for him to act because he sees me, he hears me, and he will care for me. Because that's who he is. Even in the darkest places, he will see to my care. He will provide for me. And I think it would have been such an indictment for her to kind of waltz right back in to them and saying, hey guys, what's up? I met your God. Yeah, we had a great conversation. Turns out he saw me, he hears me, and yeah, he wants you to know that. He wants you to know that he cares for me. What an indictment on them. They have used her and discarded her, and God has showed up to her and said, I see you, I care for you. Go back and name your child, Abram's child, Ishmael. I want him to remember that. And she does what they failed to do in this story. She trusts God's care and provision. She goes back and she puts herself in this position where she must rely upon and wait on God's faithfulness to her. And her presence would be a continual reminder of their failure to do just that. Friends, there are going to be times in our lives where God is going to call us to wait, to go back, or to keep going, to keep trusting his care for us, even when outwardly that seems like nothing's going to happen. Things are hopeless, completely discouraging. She had every reason to say, no thanks, I'm going to keep going home. I think I'll take my chances on the road to Egypt. But she trusts God in this moment, even though it may potentially mean more grief and more suffering, and it will in some sense. And there are going to be times when the only thing we have to hold on to in our lives is the confidence that God sees us, that he cares for us, that he will provide for us, even if outwardly things do not seem that way. There's situations where all we can do is simply wait. Simply trust that God will be good, that he will be faithful, that we can bear with, by his grace, the pain of our circumstances. There will be seasons when we must continually acknowledge, I am not in control. God, you are. And you see me, and you'll care for me, and I believe you. I want to say, as a kind of important qualification, do not hear me say in any of that what we should take from this story is that if you're in a situation in which someone is abusing you, you must go back. It's not the way it works, friends. Right? When there's ways out of that, like, God does not expect you to continue to endure that at the hands of people who are genuinely abusing you. Right? This is a unique situation in redemptive history, right? The angel of the Lord is not going to appear to you and I and say, go back and endure. It's not going to happen. But it may be the case that we are going to have moments, difficulties, painful seasons, difficult people that we have to endure with. Times where we must continue to wait on God, to be faithful, to wait on his providence, to wait on his provision, even when that seems like a dead end. Like, the Lord is going to call us to wait on him, to go back to those places, to trust him, to hold fast to his faithfulness and his care for us. And we must remind ourselves in those moments over and over and over again that God sees us, that he cares for us. We cannot lose sight of that. They lost sight of that reality. They even had such a clear sign. God will do this, not you. How quickly they forgot it. Friends, we must not lose sight of the fact that God sees us, that he cares for us, that he and he alone will bring about his promises and his purposes to us. Right? Notice how Hagar names where she's at. Right? I want to remember this. This place is called the well of the God who sees me. So every time I come back here or anybody else comes back here, it will be a living testament to that fact. It's another sign. And friends, I don't care what you and I have to do. We need those kind of things in our lives. I don't care if you need to take a piece of paper and a Sharpie and in big letters write, God sees. God sees me. And put it on your refrigerator. Like, do whatever you need to do to remind yourself every day, over and over and over again, that God is faithful, that He is present, that He cares for you, that you do not have to take matters into your own hands, that you can wait on Him to act. Friends, God sees us, He hears us, and He provides for us. All He calls us to do is simply to trust Him. Even when the hardest thing, as we sang, to do is to trust Him. That's all. We must wait and trust Him. Will you bow your heads with me? Father, we are comforted to know that You're a God who sees and cares for those who are hurting and suffering, that You see us in our darkest moments. You see us when we feel driven out, discarded. We also confess, Father, so often we are so much more like Abram and Sarah in this story, when we are the ones who try to take things into our own hands. We try to use people for our own advantage. Try to use people to bring about what we want. We try to take control of our lives. Help us to see in this story just such a clear and beautiful reminder that we don't need to do that because You care for us. You will see to our needs. You will provide what You have promised. That we can wait and we can trust You. Help us to trust You more and more. We ask these things in Jesus' name. Amen.